Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you this morning on Channel 9 and also on WJOP-LP Newburyport, FM 96.3. We're also live streaming on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm just delighted to welcome today's guests who are here to talk about a timely and important topic, the invisible wounds of military service. Michael Allard and Dr. Wesley Sanders are here, and I would just be honored to introduce you to them. First, let's start with Michael Allard. He spent his career in government, business, and healthcare, and he served as a leader at Massachusetts General Hospital for over 21 years. In 2009, he became one of the founding staff members of Home Base, a Red Sox Foundation and MGH program. Home Base was the first and is now the largest private sector program in the country dedicated to helping the invisible wounds of war through clinical care, wellness, education, and research. Michael is now their Chief Operating Officer. He's also a resident of Newburyport and has lived here with his family for the last 18 years. He currently also serves as the Newburyport School System's Medical Advisory Council to help guide and support the city's response and support for children, parents, and teachers during the pandemic, a critical task that we have to be very grateful to him for. So Michael, welcome, and thank you for taking time to visit the morning show.
Great. Thanks, Mary. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much. And now let me introduce you to Home Base staff psychologist, Dr. Wesley Sanders, himself a former Marine. Dr. Sanders specializes in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder and readjustment issues, including family and parenting difficulties. He provides both individual and group therapy services for Home Base. He received his PhD from the University of Vermont, and his research interests include a focus on supporting military and veteran families, particularly during the transition to civilian life. So, Dr. Sanders, Wes, thank you so much for visiting the morning show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. Well, Michael, I'd like to start with you. I want to congratulate you as we start because you received a great honor, the Public Service Commendation from the Department of the Army. You got that earlier this year, and it's the fourth highest public service commendation bestowed upon civilians. You were recommended for this honor because of your work with Home Base. So please tell us more about the work of Home Base, how and why they began, whom they serve, and what the organization provides for veterans.
Great. Thanks, Mary. And yeah, that was a wonderful honor, but honestly, it was a reflection of the teammates that we have here at Home Base and the work that they perform every day in service to our mission. And Home Base, it's got a wonderful origin story, as they like to say in the Marvel Comics arena.
Yeah.
As we all know, back in 2007, the Red Sox won the World Series. And tradition is the next spring training, which happened in 2008, the team goes down to the White House and they visit the president. And they did so with then President Bush. But what not all teams do is the Red Sox scheduled a visit over to Walter Reed, and they had planned about an hour-long visit. That turned into about a 4-hour-long visit.
Wow.
And the players, the manager, Terry Francona, and the ownership had gone on that visit. And that turned out to be a very fateful event because the ownership at the time had been talking about what they wanted to do now that they had achieved their dreams and goals on the field and winning the second World Series. But what were they going to do to leave the legacy off the field? And they were very cognizant of the Yawkey family's tradition back in the 1940s and teaming up with Ted Williams to be able to launch the Jimmy Fund. Yeah. And so as they had been searching that and they walked out of Walter Reed, they knew, and if you've ever been to Walter Reed, you will understand that they needed to focus on supporting our military veterans and their family members. And so that began a journey for the Red Sox ownership, and in particular Tom Werner, whose father served in World War II, to be able to find out what they wanted to do. And they fast realized after talking to Senator Kennedy and many of others in the military leadership that the invisible wounds was an issue that no one organization, government or private, could really get their hands around, and that there was a massive gap in the approach to being able to heal those invisible wounds. And as we'll talk about a little later, I know, the devastation for our military communities has been significant. And so they approached Mass General, which has the #1 ranked psychiatry and physical medicine rehab programs in the country. And they asked that the MGH team up with the Red Sox to launch home base. And that's at that point where I was asked to step in and help put together all of the governance and funding and operational plans. And I can tell you, it has been an incredible private partnership, private-public partnership that has healed and saved thousands of lives since our beginnings in 2009.
Well, that is a wonderful origin story, and such an important convergence of the desire to continue a vision and create a compelling legacy to build upon the triumph of the Red Sox and the celebratory energy, but also to focus it on other superheroes, our veterans, and to help them with the wounds that aren't always so visible and that people don't always know about or understand, but that are very compelling and often very long lasting. So thank you for that origin story, Michael. And thank you for taking on the work that you do with them. But Michael, I also know that you have a very personal connection with the veterans served by home base. And I was hoping that you could tell us what happened to your uncle, an Air Force veteran, and about the impact this tragic event in his life had on you and your family.
Yeah, what was interesting is when the leadership of the hospital had called me in 2009, what they didn't realize is that my own family had experienced a significant loss with my uncle, who I was extremely close to. I was at a relatively young age in my early teens, but my uncle served in the United States Air Force and ended up dying by suicide in a way that was both shocking and horrific for all of us, but also has, as those families who survived the completion of a suicide, has an incredible impact on all family members. And so I know what that looks like and that feels like, from my grandparents at the time to my dad and my cousins. And I knew that when this opportunity had come about with home base, that there was a really unique moment in life that we could create something that would, in my dreams, hope that we could avoid what my family had gone through. And so, when I think about what drives the passion for me in being able to support our veterans and their family members, it's very personal, and no one should ever have to go through that. And I think we've been able to bring some solutions to a very challenging problem.
No one should ever have to go through that, and no one should have to ever go through that alone or without support, which is what home base provides. I was just shocked by the heartbreaking statistics about the epidemic of suicide among current military members and among veterans. So I was hoping next that you could describe the scope of the problem for us, and either Michael or Wes, whichever one of you would like to take on describing the really heartbreaking scope of this problem today.
Sure, I can jump in, and then I'll ask Dr. Sanders to add his excellent perspective. So I think one of the challenges in looking at our suicide, both for our military and our veterans, is to put it into some historical context. And so if we look at over the past 20 years, essentially these most current wars, there was an important phenomenon that happened in the mid 2000s, about 2006 or so. And that was that our veteran suicide rate, for the first time in recent memorable history, surpassed our civilian suicide rate. And one of the things we'll talk about a little later is that our veterans are very resilient. It is hard to get into the military. There's a lot of criteria to get into the military. And so there's a lot of training that goes with this. But there's less training on the back end in terms of what happens and how do you get your support when you exit the military. And so this was when the larger countries started to understand the impact of the invisible wounds with that rate. But even in more stark terms, we've lost over 7,000 service members as a result of these wars who've been killed in action during their deployments. In balance to that, however, we've lost over 100,000 veterans to suicide since 9/11. And so, for us, we look at it in terms of, veterans of all eras, which that number represents. But in particular, I think with this generation, there are some unique aspects of these wars that have really challenged us in being able to get ahead of this issue.
Yeah, that's what I was interested in finding out about. What is it about current day wars that might underlie the origins of this really epidemic of suicide, in contrast, say, to World War II or the Korean War or other earlier wars? So I'm interested in your understanding of what those factors are. So,
Dr. Sanders, you want
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. And I'll add too, in terms of the scope of the epidemic, one thing to note is the experience of trauma among those who have served is not just limited to the military service. There are estimates now that about 62% of veterans know another veteran who's died by suicide. So
wow.
It kind of continues to ripple from there, and of course can impact the mental health and well-being of our veterans long after they've served. In terms of some of the factors that contribute to this higher rate, first of all, it's worth noting that we have amazing medicine nowadays that allows for survival rates that are much higher than in previous conflicts. One of the challenges, though, is that among those who survive a lot of these combat events, there's a high rate of experience of traumatic brain injuries, which can dramatically impact mental health and well-being themselves. Yeah. The wars that we're fighting are largely asymmetrical, meaning we're not always directly conflicting with another enemy force. It might be kind of that fear or looking out for danger when an IED explodes on the road. So a lot of it is kind of the constant vigilance in a way that is very different from the direct conflicts of previous wars. I think those factors play a big role. And of course, we also know that military culture and the idea of making sure that you are strong and that you are not getting help and doing things on your own increases resilience and that desire to push forward in the military, but can be incredibly counterproductive when it comes time to getting help ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a number of factors I'm understanding from you. The asymmetric, that's an interesting thing. From what you're describing, it sounds as though your body would be filled with adrenaline and stress hormones constantly. And of course, that's a huge health risk mentally and physically. And also that kind of like, what does it mean to be strong? And in the past, we have a culture, I think both military and non-military, that says that in particular, masculinity, being a man, being a soldier, means not showing signs of stress or reaching out for help. And if you have a physical wound, it's obvious, you need a bandage, but these invisible wounds that do have a physical manifestation on the inside with the level of stress hormones and an impact on a brain, and as well as emotional impacts, but they're not visible to the rest of us. And so it's wonderful, so wonderful that you're helping people understand through home base more about their still wounds, even if we can't see them. So, I wanted to ask you about some of the other specific manifestations of the invisible wounds of war so that we can increase their visibility and create greater empathy and support for people who are carrying these legacies of their military service. Let's talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, which I know, Dr. Sanders, is one of your areas of great focus. It's a diagnostic category that I think has crept into public awareness because it shows up in TV shows and movies all the time. So people know that it exists. But I'm not always sure myself that people really understand what it means in any specific psychological or medical sense. And so I'm hoping that that you could talk to us a little bit about what it really means as a diagnosis. What's going on inside a person who's experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. What makes it post or after impact? And how long after an initiating trauma does it sometimes take for these effects to show up?
Yeah, and this is actually something I talk about with my patients pretty frequently, because a lot of us have different conceptions about post-traumatic stress disorder. From a diagnostic perspective, we specifically describe a traumatic event as something that evokes kind of that life or death survival response. So a situation where we are under the threat of death, perceive ourselves to be under threat, or witnessing someone else going through that kind of experience. It can be direct, so thinking about our fellow service members, conflicts in terms of firefights, IEDs, those kinds of experiences. It can also be indirect, so thinking about drone pilots who might not be present for some of the casualties inflicted in war, but are still witnessing this every day through the nature of their work. And so those are some of the aspects around traumatic events. Sometimes they can also evoke a feeling of helplessness. So thinking about being unable to escape from a situation or unable to protect ourselves, that combination with the nature of a traumatic event can be incredibly overwhelming. And also, these are often situations that evoke an enormous emotional response, primarily fear.
Yeah.
In fact, in terms of how this affects the brain, you can think of kind of the survival mode that our brain goes into when the amygdala activates during that fear response. So if you've heard of the fight, flight, or freeze response that we have as a biological adaptive response, that's what the brain is shifting gears into during a traumatic event. And now, experiencing a traumatic event doesn't necessarily mean that someone has post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, most individuals who experience a traumatic event during their lifetime do not necessarily go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Diagnostically, we're looking for at least a month out from some of these experiences to allow for that natural healing process to happen. And in terms of how we conceptualize it from a treatment perspective, a lot of it has to do with our efforts to cope, and how sometimes our efforts to cope with that traumatic experience can get in the way or interfere with our ability to process those memories. As you can imagine, it is very intimidating to kind of think about these experiences. It can be very overwhelming to the body. And so we naturally try to engage in different strategies to avoid thinking about or re-experiencing this memory. And post-traumatic stress disorder can develop when we've found ways to kind of adapt to that avoidance. So staying far away from any reminders, becoming really withdrawn, breaking off connections with people that we care about or people that we served with, and doing this in a way that becomes sustained, makes it really hard to then process the memory. And that's actually one of the main ways that we try to address that in treatment as well.
Well, that's really interesting the way you describe it. If I'm understanding you, then a lot of the coping strategies that we might engage in are designed really to suppress the memory because it can feel overwhelming to confront head on. But what those do is actually, that's the post part. They just, delay it, and then, when it finally does manifest, it prevents us from being able to process it, but actually, I assume from what you're saying, makes it worse because it then disrupts our life in many ways, because the coping strategies themselves are often not as constructive as meeting the memory head on and being able to process it and therefore heal it. Have I understood you correctly?
Yeah, that's correct, Mary. And you can think about, thought suppression, right? If we try to suppress our thinking, the challenge there, if you were to sit down for 30 seconds and try not to think about something, even just the act of trying not to think about it requires you to identify what it is you're trying not to think about. And, traumatic memories bring with them just enormous physiological impacts as well. So heart racing, sweatiness, panic feelings, and they can become so disorienting when we are recalling the memory that it might be hard to tell reality from the past. This is what you might have heard of as flashbacks, where our mind is kind of replaying some of those experiences. So they're not just unpleasant memories, they're horrific memories that can become really hard to tolerate. And we naturally try to find some way to avoid. It's really only if our avoidance becomes so severe that it's impacting that ability to process the memory that it can really interfere with that recovery.
Yeah. it actually makes it more power, gives it more power over us. So it keeps the trauma alive is I think, in effect, what you're describing. Well, thank you. That was really good description. I appreciate that. What are the most effective ways then in your work, Dr. Sanders, that you try and help people with this to find a constructive and effective way to actually process what happened to them?
So there are two what are called evidence-based treatments. And when I say evidence-based treatments, what I mean is these are therapies that have been tested in randomized clinical trials. They've been found to be significantly more effective for the treatment of PTSD than standard talk therapy, for example, which can be helpful. Having someone to talk with and have support, of course, can be helpful. These have been found to be more helpful for the treatment of PTSD. One form of therapy is called prolonged exposure therapy. This is a therapy we offer at home base. The goal here is to provide a calm, supportive environment to help the veteran essentially recall some of the experiences that they've gone through that they might be avoiding, to feel like, to your point about that power over us, to regain our power over our memories. And we also know that with repeatedly recalling and talking about and allowing ourselves to experience these memories, they start to go through a process of what's called habituation. Our mind starts to kind of get used to the memory a little bit. The physical sensations that are telling us we're under threat start to go away as our mind recognizes the memory for what it is, a memory, something that's happened in the past. And we also do this in the form of present focused therapy called in vivo therapy, which is all about helping veterans be able to access things in their environment that they normally avoid because they invoke some of those fear responses. We're in a city, here in Boston, so we have the ability to always find spaces where it's a little bit busier, a little bit noisier, and we practice a gradual, slow increase in habituating to some of those experiences in the civilian world that can be really difficult for veterans to kind of get more acclimated to. So that's one therapy approach we use,
So the desensitization, I think, is what you're talking about. It kind of shifts the memory. Well, it makes it a memory rather than something that can feel like something that is happening now. It sort of shifts it habituates. That's a great name for it. And because we've all habituated to things, we can connect with what that means. And so it shifts it and keeps it from being the driving force really in our life. It becomes a memory, still a difficult memory, but an experience that we're recalling rather than one that we're reliving. Have I understood you?
That's correct. Our mind is oftentimes trying to process after a traumatic event the details of what happened. And because it's so overwhelming to our body, that confusion about reality versus the past is something that can be reconciled through this form of therapy by allowing that memory to become firmly seated in the past and essentially stored away in our long-term storage. We'll never forget what happened. Our goal is not to make the memory pleasant. It's to make it less impactful so that we're not overwhelmed when we think about it.
Yeah. Well, I noticed the mention on your website of something called virtual reality exposure, which made me curious. Is that what it sounds like? Are there goggles involved? In other words?
Yes, I can think. There is. It's interesting. There's a lot of fascinating developments in the treatment of PTSD that are just about to come online, and some like virtual reality for prolonged exposure therapy has arrived. When we look at it, the diagnosis of PTSD is fairly new. It was not recognized by the American Psychiatric Association until 1980. So you think about all those Vietnam veterans who had suffered prior to 1980 and trying to sort through, this hasn't been a condition. And so one of the things that we've with our chief of psychiatry here at Mass General, what we've talked about is that the world of mental health care is really operating at an AM radio level in a digital medical world. And so we have one of the best AM radios in the country, but there is so much more needed to be able to, evolve the actual methodologies and models of care that we have. Virtual reality, prolonged exposure is one of those. A lot of the groundbreaking work was founded by a clinician by the name of Skip Rizzo out of the University of South Carolina. University of Southern California. And what they realized is that with some patients who are struggling even through that prolonged exposure treatment, they are resistant to it, and there's blocks that go on with it. So the use of virtual reality, which is not an overly detailed virtual reality environment, but it does place veterans in Iraq or Afghanistan scenes, can help sort of unlock some of those elements of that prolonged exposure therapy that may be a difficult situation with a particular veteran. It is not for everyone. So one of the great things about our clinicians is that they really work to individualize the treatments. And I think that's an important hallmark when you look at sort of the gaps that we were trying to address when we founded Home Base. We knew that the treatments in trauma, such as prolonged exposure, were validated and they could be very effective. The challenge is when you look at the mental health community, a very small portion of our clinicians out in the United States are actually trained in providing this treatment. And so for our folks like Dr. Sanders, they've gone through extensive training to be able to deliver that. And that's an important component. But the other component is, how are you setting yourself up so that you can think about what are the other gaps? And one of the things that we identified really out the gate was that family members are a critical component, as we know, to healing. And yet the VA, who does wonderful work, was very limited, almost by its construct, to be able to care for family members. And so a lot of the services that we designed was really oriented around treating or educating family members in the model of care that we deliver. And oftentimes it's the family member who calls Home Base first, because that veteran is going through their symptoms of PTSD and they're avoiding. And so we'll work with that family member oftentimes weeks or months, even before that veteran is able to get that care. And then one final piece, Mary, I'll share is that outpatient treatment can be very effective, but we know there are some built-in challenges. And so when you look at the average number of visits that patients in general, civilian or veterans, have in the United States for their mental health care, the number is 3. Well, a protocol for prolonged exposure therapy is anywhere from 12 to 16 sessions. So if you're only getting to 3 and you're dropping out of care, you're not getting the right amount of treatment that you need. So Home Base has designed programs that will flex within a veteran's life. And so Dr. Sanders mentioned at the beginning of the hour that he's home doing telehealth for his patients. And so as we know, that has taken off in COVID. Home Base has been doing this prior to COVID, but it does reduce some of those geographic barriers about not having to drive into Boston, which we all know we don't like to do sometimes. But also about 5 years ago, Home Base realized that you could be living in Springfield or frankly over the border, let's say in Nashua, New Hampshire. And because of licensing regulations, we can't practice across states. And so we set about building a 2-week intensive clinical program that really turned some of the thinking of treatment on its head from the perspective of, could you provide a full dose of treatment at 12 sessions within a 2-week period of time and have the same impact as you would, say, over a 6-month period of time. And so we've got the flexibility to be able to test this out, and we're very happy to say that you can do it. And in fact, it's almost an equivalent of 2 years worth of treatment into that 2 weeks, in which we bring veterans from all over the United States and sometimes all over the world to come in for this care and really advance the situation to really great outcomes. And so that, is some of the thinking that we've tried to bring to this and being able to push the boundaries about how these care and support elements are provided.
That's just wonderful. And a far cry, I would say, from an AM radio approach. You're offering state-of-the-art care. You're being very innovative and creative. It sounds to me like when Home Base runs up against a barrier in providing the best possible care, you just find an innovative way around it, which is very impressive and wonderful and much appreciated, I'm sure, by the people you help and their families which is so critical, of course, to any sustained kind of well-being for any of us, and by the rest of us. Where there were some other aspects of other types of invisible wounds I wanted to ask about. You've talked already about traumatic brain injury, which I know is very common, and has so many different kinds of manifestations. And you mentioned that earlier, but one of the things that I found on the list of invisible wounds on the home-based website was also military sexual trauma. And I was struck by that because it's another thing that we hear about off and on. There'll be a congressional committee that's taking it up and trying to, adopt a program that will resolve the problem or prevent it. And yet it seems to be still very common for, mostly for women, but also for men. And so I was curious to ask you to tell us a little bit more about, it's not a diagnosis. I know, and your website differentiates that it's not a diagnosis, it's an experience that people have. And yet it would appear to be a fairly common experience within the military. So I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about the frequency of the experience, in other words, the scale and scope of the problem, and how you try and help, and what appears to make it difficult to prevent in any sustained way. Whichever of you would like to talk about that.
I can speak to that a little bit, Mary. So
thank you.
I believe recent estimates suggest 1 in 4 women and 1 in 100 men in the military have experienced some sort of sexual assault or trauma. I suspect those numbers are highly underreported for many reasons. But as you mentioned, unfortunately, it's not as rare an experience as it really as we would really hope for. And that kind of experience can be especially traumatizing because these aren't the enemy that you're fighting on the other side of the line. These are supposed to be people who are supporting you, who are looking out for you. The system that you have volunteered into, the trust that you've placed, and to have that kind of trust violated in such a way can be especially traumatizing and difficult. The positive side of this in terms of treatment is that the treatments that we offer are very effective for helping individuals recover from military sexual trauma and PTSD symptoms, particularly that develop in the wake of military sexual trauma. In fact, the other evidence-based therapy that we largely provide here is called cognitive processing therapy. And this therapy was actually created first for sexual assault survivors in the civilian world before it was adapted to be used with military populations. So I think it's especially well tuned to some of the unique feelings of betrayal and loss of trust and that kind of interpersonal violation of military sexual trauma. This form of therapy really focuses on helping individuals take a closer look at some of the things they tell themselves afterwards. So the blame that's often accompanied by sexual trauma, of what we could have done differently, or the ownership we take for actions that are really not anything we should have to bear on our own. And this therapy really helps individuals who've experienced sexual trauma or any form of trauma to be able to examine some of those beliefs, to challenge some of those beliefs, and ideally to be able to set down some of those burdens of guilt and shame, especially when they're completely unfounded. It's just our own mind's attempt to make sense of something horrific that happened to us. And it can be really effective for those who've experienced sexual trauma.
Oh, absolutely. That sounds like a very sane and effective way of trying to help people work through, as you emphasize, not just the trauma of the assault, but the feelings of betrayal, which would just get to the heart of the matter, I would think. And do you have thoughts about why is it so hard and 1 in 4 women, that's a lot. That is, that's tragic. And 1 in 100 men is fewer, but any number is tragic. Do you have any thoughts about, I guess, to put a positive spin on it, not just what makes it so hard to prevent, but what might help us as a culture work to ameliorate the problem in some sustained way to help prevent it going forward?
Well, what I can say from my work with these patients and what they've indicated to me is just a feeling that the reporting of these things either doesn't get responded to or might be responded to in a way that's biased towards the perpetrator. It might be uncomfortable to report because there's a feeling that you are breaking down unit cohesion by rocking the boat. There's a lot of kind of systemic factors that make it harder to report and then make those reports less likely to be taken seriously or responded to. I think the U.S. military is currently reconciling with that right now as they examine their system of reporting and how that can be more effective. But I think finding ways to make those voices heard and responded to, respected, and addressed is one of the biggest challenges that makes this epidemic particularly difficult for the military.
Well, and I'm sure that the work that you do to help people heal their trauma and then enable them to clear any feelings of guilt or shame that they have can only strengthen their voices going forward so that they can advocate for themselves and can also get the rest of us to participate in our own forms of advocacy. So once again, home base does wonderful things. So, I'm curious to find out, what do each of you wish that we in the public understood better about the impact that military service has on our fellow human beings, especially the exposure during war to experiences that are at the extremes of physical and emotional duress? So what are your thoughts? Because I'm sure you've thought about it. What do you wish that we all just understood better? So,
well, Mary, I think it's important to note, just to kind of start to answer that question, that the service in the military is a very honorable profession. And that I think the first thing that I know a lot of listeners out there will think, that and rightfully horrified by the suicide rates or other challenges that veterans will have coming off of service. But the good news is that service in the military is one of the best professions out there, and many thrive. And they really go on, as we know, historically and in these times, to some wonderful careers and contributing back to our society, just like Dr. Sanders. And so I think it's important that we don't always categorize our veterans as always being wounded, because that's not always the case.
Right. Yeah.
Now, that said, like many of us, when we transition between schools or careers and that sort of thing, I think there is a very unique element that our military does face in transitioning from their service back into the civilian society that is very hard for civilians to really comprehend. And I think while our military does a great job of selecting those who serve and training them to do their jobs, and for the first time in our country's history, it is an all volunteer military. Nobody is, as we know, is conscripted or in the draft, which I would say most those who serve in the military would agree with, because it really does professionalize their environments. But everyone has a transition challenge or journey that they go through, and that's because it is very difficult to train to come back into society, to come back into that civilian society. And that's both for the active duty, and then there's a really important and special note around our Guard and Reserve units, who in these wars have been depended on more so than any other time in our history as well. And so you've got folks who served in the Guard, they go off for a year, they come back, they go right into their civilian jobs within a week's period of time, which is very fast. And then a couple of years later, they go back, and that continues to happen. So if any one of us was put into that situation, you're gonna have some transition challenges in between all of that. And so I think our country has evolved greatly in terms of supporting our veterans, supporting those who serve, really piecing apart. You can disagree with the war, but you can support the warrior. But I think it's the next level down to be able to really get familiar with what it means to sort of being 20 years of war and going through a very different type of environment. You mentioned World War II. In World War II, our service members, they deployed, They were there on actually for a long time, 2, 3
Yeah.
plus years, but then they all came home.
Yes.
And so they did not have this asymmetric or sort of back and forth environment. So I think that would be very important. And then I would just say, if you start asking some questions of folks that you know around town, you'll realize that you're about 1 degree separated from somebody who has served in the military, and that today's warfighter is really a family versus a single young man. And when we talk about the makeup of the military, women are the fastest rising segment of the military. They have children. And so it's a very different environment than I think sometimes we conventionally think about when our eye is not so much on it.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. That's really helpful and really important things for us to think about and be aware of. Both what's consistent over time is the transition between being in the military and coming home. And of course, you mentioned World War II. Both my parents were World War II veterans, and when they came home, there was the GI Bill, and there were plenty of jobs, and a welcoming public to whom they were heroes who had saved civilization. And that was very different, certainly, than the Vietnam War era. And it's yet a different kind of environment now. So that transition, though, is very consistent. And of course, that is part of the work that Home Base does, which is to be aware of what the steps in that transition are and what some of the vulnerabilities will be. And of course, to be able to help you. I know, Dr. Sanders, that's one of your specialties. So would you like to comment on some of the challenges and how you help people overcome them?
Absolutely. I think if you try to imagine, for listeners as well, do you have a parent who has served in the military, or do you have a child who has served in the military? What we know nowadays is those numbers are less than ever. There are communities that serve, and then communities who might not have that connection, who don't have a direct family member who has served. And that military-civilian gap has been widening over the past several decades to the degree where it can almost feel like two different worlds. And in fact, here in New England, I've had many veterans I've worked with comment that the military installations and military presence is far different than some of the places they served in bases in Texas or Georgia, other states down south. So when they get out of the military, there isn't a military community of civilians who have been kind of steeped in that local base and understand a little bit about that culture. And it can be very jarring, very kind of difficult to acclimate to here in this environment, or really any civilian environment. So part of the work that I do with veterans is trying to help that adjustment process move forward. Part of it is practical, figuring out how to accommodate different perspectives than your own and the civilian way of thinking that might be very different from what you learned in a more rigid military structure. And then part of it is more kind of understanding who we are now that we are no longer in the military. So I was in the Marines. You say once a Marine, always a Marine. And yet at the same time, right, there's still a civilian identity that has to be explored and understood, and helping veterans to kind of figure out what that identity is going to look like. They're going into school and they're maybe in their 30s, right? And all of the people in school are much younger. It feels different, and they're still trying to explore some of those identity factors that they might not have had the opportunity to do while they were serving. And then the other piece we do with readjustment work partly is kind of processing the military experience, sometimes even grieving in a way, because that was a life that kind of came to an end, sometimes rather suddenly, sometimes not on our own terms. And being able to kind of look back and process essentially the loss of that experience and recognition that we won't have that experience again can be really helpful. And it looks very different from PTSD treatment, for example.
But really vital, and I'm sure just extraordinarily helpful for the people who are making that transition, because they're not on their own. Actually, one of the kind of wrap-up questions I wanted to ask you both is, I'm curious to find out, what do you hear from the service members and veterans that you work with? What do they tell you is most helpful to them about what they're able to experience through Home Base?
Dr. Sanders, do you want to take that one first?
I think in terms of helpfulness, it's both the individual services that help them to recover and to find ways to get back into their life, do the things that they want to do to be able to re-engage, but also feeling like the challenges that their family is experiencing are taken seriously as well. So we have a lot of services that sometimes directly just work with the family member to help them to find ways to get that balance back. For one, I run a parenting group because we know that parenting difficulties exacerbate PTSD symptoms and vice versa. So helping veterans and their family adjust to parenting needs and adjust to different parenting styles after one person is no longer deploying can be really impactful for their mental health, even though it's not something you think of when you might think about mental health treatment. And I think that kind of personalized and family-based approach are some of the things that the vets that I've worked with have expressed appreciation for.
I can imagine that would be enormously impactful and greatly appreciated. And I know earlier, Michael, you said often it's family members who initiate the outreach to home base. And then for the whole family to be able to participate in a holistic, systemic way sounds like just a huge gift that you're able to give. Well, and it's not just the service members and their families, it's our whole country that benefits from the work you do, because it makes us healed and whole, or more so, headed in the right direction at any rate. Michael, is that kind of the same thing that you hear from the veterans that give you feedback about their experience through home base?
It is. I think our veterans who come into this home-based community have felt understood. They felt safe, that they could raise their hand and say, I need help, which is often the hardest challenge when it comes to getting somebody on the path to healing. And then for us, I know we've talked a lot about, sort of the evidence-based treatments that we provide. And you mentioned holistic, and one thing we haven't talked as much about, but is very much to the core of what we do, is we really treat the mind and the body and the soul. And so we have a whole dedicated health and fitness effort that is actually originally designed by the Red Sox and the Patriots medical leadership, but really surrounds our veterans for their health goals, to pair them up with a nutritionist, strength and conditioning coaches, some of whom are led by 101st Airborne veteran here at the program, and really kind of look at, we know we want to heal your mind, but as we know, if you can heal your body at the same time, you're just going to go that much more ahead for where you want to be. And so we like to give folks the tools that they need to be able to really go on to that next journey in their life with all the assets they need. And so it is treatment, but it's all about wellness and fitness, nutrition, mental skills, and getting you on the path to where you want to go.
Well, of course, I hadn't thought about it before, but you have the whole world of sports medicine through the Red Sox, to be the top-notch sports medicine too, the best of the best, to be able to provide to people who are availing themselves of home-based services. So I have to say that, it's certainly any Red Sox victory at any level, but especially the home series, is much celebrated by people certainly in the Boston area and New England, but there were fans spread out across the country. But that was such a fortuitous World Series victory because of what's come from it, that fortuitous visit to Walter Reed Hospital, and then the sparking of ideas and the whole kind of carefully constructed, really visionary kind of program and menu of services that you're all able to provide is simply wonderful. And so my final question for you both is, how can people learn more and how can people help home base?
Yeah, so to learn more, certainly visit our website. Mary's done a great job in helping to highlight the work that we do. So that's at homebase.org, so www.homebase.org. And so you'll be able to see all the different offerings that we provide for that. But the other thing I'll say is, and this is really special to us in the New England community and us at home base. One of the first things we did in the first year, knowing as Dr. Sanders said, that in New England, we are very patriotic. We are very supportive of our veterans, but we're not as visible. We don't have those big bases. And so one of the first things we did in the spring of 2010 is we created the Run to Home Base, which is a 9K, 5K race that starts outside Fenway. You run through Boston along the Esplanade, and then you finish by going into Fenway Park. And there's two finishes. One, which is the time finish on the warning track by the Green Monster, and then the other is the photo finish at home plate. And so it's a significant awareness and fundraiser for the program, and you can go to runtohomebase.org to find out more about that. And this year we're very grateful that we're back live on September 25th, coming up in later this fall. But even if you don't run for us, we welcome people to the park, because it is one of those few moments where you can bring military, veterans, families, and the public together to recognize what these really just wonderful men, women, and their families have done for our country since the beginning, but particularly so since 9/11 happened. And I'll just say that despite our withdrawal from Afghanistan, the challenges that our veterans face will not stop because of that. And there is so much need, particularly given the year that we've all experienced with COVID,
absolutely.
but what our veterans are going through.
Absolutely. But I must say, what a brilliant idea for a fundraiser. Who wouldn't want a photo finish in Fenway? So, gosh, that's wonderful. Well, Michael and Dr. Sanders, Wes, thank you both so much. I've just learned so much from you. And, you know, I think that your organization just does such wonderful, important work. It's just been a joy to talk to you and learn from you both about home base and what you do for military members and veterans. So thank you so much for visiting the morning show today. I really appreciate it. So thank you both.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks for taking the time to really spread the word here. We really
my honor and my pleasure. Thank you both. And thank you everybody for watching today. I hope you'll join us next Thursday as well at 9 a.m. on Channel 9 for the morning show. If you missed any part of today's show, it'll be available for viewing on Port Media's YouTube channel playlist for the morning show. Just go to ncmhub.org, click on the YouTube icon, and then playlist for the morning show and scroll down. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday at 8 a.m. and again the following Tuesday at 4 p.m. and Wednesday at 3 p.m. and will be available as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Just go to ncmhub.org and click on the cloud icon in the upper right-hand corner and scroll down. That's it for today, everybody. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Wes, Dr. Sanders. Bye now. Take care.